If I could have, woo, that's very loud. If I could have everyone's attention, we expected this would be crowded. We do have overflow rooms. I wish we could have found a bigger space. It'll be streaming. We can still take questions from the overflow room, so I just wanted to let you know, because we'd hate to have you stand this whole time. So we will take questions from that space. So if you could move over there, we don't want to produce a fire hazard, but we're comfortable with some people standing, but I hope that some of you will shift to the overflow room and know, again, that we can take questions. They're streaming it into those rooms. You might even see and hear better than some people sitting in the back. So just think about that, please. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Good evening. Thank you all for gathering tonight. There are a large number here in the May Auditorium. I see a standing room only group, and I'd like to add a welcome to those who are watching via the internet, both here in our St. Louis community and around the country, perhaps even around the world. I'd like to begin with a word of thanks to our distinguished faculty members, Jeffrey McCune and Rebecca Wanzo, for bringing us together. Faculty leadership is essential to having a strong university, and I'm grateful for their leadership. We're gathered this evening to discuss difficult issues. What's taken place in Ferguson is a challenge to this entire community. Washington University, with its 13,000 employees, its 13,000 students, 32,000 or so alumni in our St. Louis community, is deeply affected by what takes place in this community. We are grieving, and we know that we need to make some additional progress on the problems we face. In my communication to the community, I think you understand that we have problems that relate to racism, health disparities, unequal access to education, and economic opportunity. We as a university are a big part of the community. We're in fact the third largest employer in this region. We have a great many people who are talented and able to make important contributions that will make our world better. Indeed, right now, one of our aspirations is to affirm our role in preparing society's leaders. That means leaders who are going to make a contribution to addressing the challenges that we face, regionally, nationally, and internationally. Our talented students come from all 50 states and of the order of 80 countries or so, and I'm grateful that they've made a commitment to join in this discussion this evening and to take part in addressing the challenges that we see here. I'm proud that we have very important programs underway well before the unfortunate tragedy that unfolded on August 9th. Programs that I think are making a positive difference in our community. And leaders on our panel this evening are involved in these efforts. But as I've communicated also, while we might be able to note some progress, the progress we've made is inadequate, and we have to accelerate the pace of progress. We need to expand our commitment and make our whole community better. We're fortunate to have many people committed to this endeavor, and lots of communications have come in to me, to our Provost, Holden Thorpe, and communications have come in to other academic leaders here at Washington University. I've asked Provost Holden Thorpe and Associate Provost Dedrick Carter to implement a program that helps us improve our communications on all that's going on, and also to begin coordinating new initiatives that might take place, or initiatives that are already underway where people might be able to play an important role. So I want to thank everybody for becoming engaged. I hope you've had the opportunity to explore our new website, WashU Voices, Ferguson and Beyond. We've already had some very creative and important contributions coming from members of our community, students included. I'm proud of that, and I look forward to more. I myself will look forward to the important contributions that our panelists will make this evening and to the discussion that will follow. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Provost of Washington University, Dr. Holden Thorpe. Holden?
Thank you, Chancellor, and thank you all for being here tonight. This is precisely the kind of event that we imagined when we started putting together ideas about how we would respond to the events that have happened in our region. This is an important night for our university and our community, and thanks to the Chancellor and everybody who has supported the work that we have been really just trying to facilitate as the folks in our community have come forward with things that they want to share and initiate. And I would like to acknowledge Dedrick Carter, who's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. He and I have been talking about the issues in our community over the last year or so as he has transitioned into our office. The economic development parts of this are things that he and I have worked on, and the persistent issues of segregation and inequality that persist in our region are have been on our mind long before this. But having Dedrick here has been a huge help as we initiated this. He is under orders to be on vacation right now, which he had long since planned. But he is coordinating this for our office, and he's easy to find. I shared some thoughts on our WashU Voices website, and I won't go through all of them today, but the folks who are here on the panel, many of them have been helping me understand since I arrived in St. Louis the challenges that we face as a region, the tension between the city and the county, the persistent segregation and inequality, the multiple townships that are trying to coordinate here. You've got some of the great experts in St. Louis to lead us through all of that. And the reason I work in higher education is because American universities, despite their problems and frustrations that we have over the course of our nation's history been the most reliable source of opportunity, and certainly the most reliable place to bring together the different disciplines that it takes to solve the kind of challenges that we are all here to discuss tonight. And excellent universities embrace both of these missions every single day. And we do, but we need to do better. We need to do more to provide the educational opportunities that people of our country deserve. We need to do a better job of reflecting the St. Louis and America that we serve. We need to do more to address the uneven access to health care in our region. And we need to do more to provide the knowledge and talent needed to solve the kinds of problems that we're here to discuss tonight. And you're helping us do that, and thank you for being here. One of the people who's helped me understand a lot of these issues is my colleague Rebecca Wanzo, who will be the leader of our discussion tonight. She is Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Associate Director of the Center for Humanities at Washington University. Her research areas include African American literature and culture, cultural studies, theories of affect, popular culture, feminist theory, and critical race theory. Her book, The Suffering Will Not Be Televised, African American Women and Sentimental Political Storytelling, uses African American women as a case study to explore the kinds of narrative conventions people utilize to make their suffering legible to institutions. She has published essays on a wide range of topics, including African American women in film and television, political discourse in graphic storytelling, and post-civil rights era discourse. She is a recipient of fellowships from the Ford Foundation, and she is currently part of the Modern Segregation Project at Washington University, which examines the theoretical, structural, and historical issues shaping contemporary segregation. Please welcome my colleague, Rebecca Wanzo.
So good evening. It really pleases Jeffrey and I to no end to see this many people show up. I really want to thank Chancellor Wrighton and Provost Thorpe for their help with this event. And I think one thing that's important to know is there were lots of people saying, we need to do something. So we put together one event, but you need to know that lots of people are planning lots of things because this topic is going to last more than one evening. And the things we need to do need more than one discussion. So I also want to thank a number of others for their work, including the staffs at the Teaching Center, Media Services, Event Management, and Public Affairs. And I specifically want to thank Luke Gregory and Residential Life, Barb Liebman, Kathy Jensen-Pearson, and Kathy Fields in the Center for the Humanities, and Gail Boker in the Office of the Provost, who was the primary coordinator for this evening. We are all aware, I'm sure, that 2014 marks the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For many people, the Brown v. Board decision in 1954 and a number of other legal changes in the second half of the 20th century marked the end of structural inequality in the United States. But despite these changes, we live with the fact that the Census Bureau reported in 2012 that over 27% of African Americans live in poverty, more than double the percentage of whites or Asians. 1 in 3 African American men will go to prison in their lifetime, a statistic shaped, as Michelle Alexander explains so eloquently in The New Jim Crow, by well-documented disparate treatment of African Americans in arrest and sentencing. These inequalities begin as early as preschool, as African Americans are far more likely at that age and for the rest of their educational careers to be suspended or expelled for the same offenses as other racial groups. And for some people, these well-documented differences in treatment are simply a measure of African American cultural values producing different results or individuals making bad choices. It is not a sign of anything structural. But for others, particularly those who study racial inequality, is a sign of the unfulfilled promise of 1964 and the Civil Rights Movement. The statistics are a sign of a dream deferred. But the shooting of Mike Brown by Officer Darren Wilson and its aftermath highlights, perhaps better than any of the other police-involved deaths in recent months, the consequences of what seems to be an impasse in ways of seeing. Part of what made Brown's death such a flashpoint for the ongoing conversation about police treatment of people of color is the number of people who witnessed the shooting and the far larger number of people who were present later and questioned the treatment of Michael Brown's body. To understand the history of anger about police treatment is to understand how often Black witnessing has been deemed inadequate, and serious injury to African Americans has been treated as proportionate. I was a teenager when I followed the trial of the officers accused of using excessive force on Rodney King, and that was the first time I learned that what seemed just completely obvious to me about Black pain was not obvious to others. I remember following the Amadou Diallo case in 1999 when he was shot at 41 times and struck 19 times when reaching for his wallet. Surely, I thought, the jury will find him guilty of murder. But again, I discovered my way of seeing, while shared by some, was not shared by those who could have chosen to vote guilty. Thus, the story, a local one, is also part of an ongoing national debate about the relationship of African Americans and others to the police, and more broadly part of an ongoing debate about inequality in daily life. I think it is easy in spaces like universities for some people to see these events as far from their daily lives. And indeed, we are being disingenuous if we fail to recognize that some people are constantly hurt by structural inequality and others are not. But at the same time, these events, this history belongs to all of us. We may live in divided cities, deeply segregated cities, but Ferguson should remind everyone that even if you feel far removed from inequality, it will touch you. We may ignore it or acknowledge it, but we cannot disavow the realities that shape the larger community that we call home. So this is a panel about where we live, both locally and nationally, and about what we should know about structures that shape our home. I hope people in the audience have availed themselves of other gatherings at churches, Harris-Stowe University has had a number, or in the streets where people are talking about and acting on the issues we'll discuss this evening. But tonight, I've gathered people largely in the WashU community, but not exclusively, who can help us think about structure and history, even if the problems we face seem insurmountable. But when I feel despair, I think of the words of the greatest theorist of racial inequality in the 20th century, James Baldwin. He wrote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So here's the panel that will help us face some things. So we'll start with Katherine Goldwasser. She's professor of law here at Washington University. Her areas of expertise include criminal procedure, evidence and trial practice. She's placed essays in Harvard Law Review, Georgetown Law Journal, and Emory Law Journal. Currently, she directs the government lawyering externship program, which provides students with the opportunity to work with attorneys in the criminal and civil divisions of the U.S. Attorney's offices for both the Eastern District of Missouri and the Southern District of Illinois. She also is a practicum supervisor for a teaching and mentoring program she created through which law students work with inner-city high school students at Northwest Academy of Law in the city of St. Louis. And I'll go through everyone, and then they can just speak in order. Next, we have Justin Hansford, who's visiting us, assistant professor at St. Louis University School of Law. His research incorporates legal history, legal ethics, critical race theory, human rights, and the global justice movement, in a broader attempt to interrogate justice in society. He has a BA from Howard and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center, where he was a founder of the Georgetown Journal of Law and Modern Critical Race Perspectives. After obtaining his JD, Professor Hansford assisted in the founding of Imagine Southeast Public Charter School in Washington, D.C. He then worked as a staff member with the Obama for American Presidential Campaign and in the White House Office of Presidential Personnel. We will then hear from Bob Hansman, associate professor in the Sam Fox School, and I'll say that if you have not been on one of Bob's extraordinary tours of St. Louis neighborhoods, you should correct that very soon. An accomplished artist, he has held several solo exhibitions of his work in and around the St. Louis area. He is also highly involved in community programs. He works as director of City Faces and the Jermaine Lamont Roberts Memorial Art Studio and the Clinton Peabody Housing Project, has garnered national attention and awards. And for years, he has had his students working with residents in the 22nd Ward in St. Louis City. Next, we'll hear from Jeffrey McCune, Associate Professor of Performing Arts and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and my colleague and partner in envisioning this panel. Jeffrey's research interests include popular culture, masculinity, critical race, gender, and sexuality theory, performance studies, queer theory, cultural and media communication, and African American literature. He recently published his first book, Sexual Discretion, Black Masculinity and the Politics of Passing, from University of Chicago Press, a fairly daring intervention into down-low discourse that circulates around black masculinity. So we also welcome back WashU alum and Irvin scholar, Brittany Packnett, Executive Director of Teach for America St. Louis since 2012. Brittany is a founding member of the Young Citizens Council, a group of young leaders in the region who formed in the wake of Mike Brown's shooting death, seeking justice and to amplify the voice and needs of area young people of color. Brittany also serves on the boards of Cultural Leadership and New City School, the COCA Associate Board, and the John Burroughs School Board Diversity Committee. She's received numerous honors, including St. Louis Business Journal's 30 Under 30, and is the youngest honoree in the history of the Urban League Women in Leadership Award. And last, but certainly not least, Jason Q. Purnell, assistant professor in the Brown School. He is trained in both applied psychology and public health. Prior to joining the faculty at Washington University, Jason Purnell served as Director of Community Engagement for the United Way of Greater St. Louis. His work was primarily focused on aiding in strategic planning and community action planning with the largest group of African American clergy in St. Louis. In addition to a number of other projects, he is the lead researcher in the For Sake of All project, which I encourage all of you to read. It's a multidisciplinary study of African American health and well-being in St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming this distinguished panel.
Sure. Good evening. Kathy Goldwasser again. I am going to say just a few words from a few different perspectives. One, because criminal procedure is my field, and in fact, True confession, I am a former prosecutor. I was a federal prosecutor in Chicago for a number of years before I began to teach. So I'm going to just say a few words about some of the criminal issues that it's my understanding, it certainly are the ones that seem to be receiving the most attention. There are a million other legal issues that also have received a lot of attention that I'm not going to speak to. One of the issues that has been a very hot topic of conversation is about grand juries. And first of all, the use of the grand jury, right? In Missouri, there are actually, as you know, state charges being considered and federal charges being considered. The federal charges, if they're brought, have to be brought by a grand jury. The state charges do not have to be brought by a grand jury. In fact, a local prosecutor can simply sign a piece of paper and charge somebody with a felony under Missouri law. So some questioned Bob McCullough's decision to use the grand jury in St. Louis County, and more questioned his presence involved in it at all because of possible bias. I will say that I think there are probably some reasons for using the grand jury that subpoena power, the ability to bring people in to really conduct an investigation that doesn't really happen when it's just the prosecutor bringing a charge, that you probably could make some reasonable arguments for why, in this situation where there's a lot of conflicting evidence and a lot of conflicting witnesses, this might be a reasonable thing to do. But the secrecy of it, which is true of all grand juries, is, of course, given the skepticism about law enforcement generally, feeds right into that. And you know, I have to say then that it's reasonable to ask, and this may be shocking to a lot of people, is he even going to be charged with a state crime? Okay? And there are certain, when you start thinking about what the possibilities would be for the grand jury, I know that there are people who have a view, and I'm not going to reject it, that there's some really big conspiratorial kind of a thing going on. But I think more likely what they might be considering, if in possible charges, would be a manslaughter charge, an involuntary manslaughter charge in the first degree and the second degree. I understand some people think that the killing may well have been completely deliberate. I don't discount that, but I have to say that in terms of what a grand jury is likely to really be considering, it would be more likely, I think, to be those involuntary manslaughter kinds of charges. And I think if charges are brought, I have to say that given the not just experience here, but experience across the country, the likelihood that he will be convicted of anything is very, very low. Okay, I don't say impossible, but that's just, that's how it has gone, and not just in St. Louis, okay? Federally, where the grand jury has to be used, I think that it may well be that a federal charge, criminal civil rights violation, would be brought. There isn't just general federal criminal law, but this is the one that's been discussed. It is very hard to convict somebody of a criminal civil rights violation. It requires a showing of specific intent to not just be out there being a police officer, not being negligent, not being reckless, not being careless, but actually intending specifically to deprive him of his civil rights, okay? That is a very difficult thing to do. So those are some of the legal issues. Of course, there's the issue about police use of force and deadly force. I can say that under Missouri law, as written, I have to say that some of it appears to perhaps permit things that wouldn't be permitted under the federal Constitution. But the one thing it does permit that is permitted under the federal Constitution is the use of deadly force when an officer reasonably believes, rightly or wrongly, that life, some kind of life, his own or another, is in danger. And as we, I think, all know, a version of events that has been presented as the officer's version is precisely what he did. I do not mean to suggest that that is my version of events, but that is his, okay? So I imagine these things might be raised as questions. I do want to speak to one more thing before I stop. Wrap up soon. Thank you. Soon. Okay. Apart from the criminal law, I'm a human being, and my very, very, very dear friend, Kimberly Norwood, also a colleague of mine at the law school. I don't know if any of you, by any chance, saw the piece that she wrote and that was posted to CNN online. But she wrote a piece that was, it started, I'm a 54-year-old black woman, a mother, a lawyer, a law professor. I teach at this wonderful university, and I live 12 miles from Ferguson, okay? And she then proceeds to recount her experience living as an African-American woman in this community, raising African-American children, all right? And she presents some vignettes of that experience. It is a very low-key, here's what happened. One of the stories is needing to contact the chief of police in her community in Creve Coeur before she and her husband went on a cruise because she wanted that, and sending him pictures of her sons, because she wanted to be sure that he knew that these very large African-American men were going to be walking through the neighborhood. And she wanted him to know what they looked like. Okay? And as she says in her piece, I've asked myself how many parents of white sons have thought to add to their to-do before leaving town list, write letter to local police department introducing sons and attaching photos so police do not become suspicious, okay? I mean, for those who say we're post-racial, right, there. And I want to just share with you a few of the comments, okay, that she's drawn in. I know we can say CNN comments, all right? She emailed the police chief. I don't think the problem starts with them, but with her. You have to call the police to tell them your boys are going to be walking to class? Give me a break. It's always someone else's fault. Stop blaming actions from 150 years ago. None of us were alive then. We can't change what some believe has already happened. Stop reinforcing racism. It amazes me how educated, intelligent people such as the author adopt this mindset. This article is the biggest bag of wine about racism I've ever seen. Quit looking for reasons to be pitied. Okay? Okay. That is something I think all of us, as we think about what we're going to do, what I think about is, no, I do not share her experience, but I do, need to consider it, understand it, and try to deal with it. And part of what we got to deal with is that there are people out there, many, who think she has simply made this up. Okay?
Well, that was wonderful. Can't wait to engage you on some of these legal issues. But today is the 69th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. 69 years ago today, he was 14 years old. He was killed in Mississippi. And I think his narrative, his story, resonates with me and should resonate with all of us, especially in context of what we're facing now. And as I think back to all of the different incidents we faced as a community, I think Emmett Till provides the most apt analogy. It's a situation, 1955, Mississippi, where there is a legacy of impunity for violence against people of color, especially African Americans in the South. Emmett Till walks into a convenience store. He has an interaction with a young woman who worked in that convenience store. They say he whistled at her. And there was a minor, a small interaction, a minor faux pas, if you will, that enraged the husband and the brother-in-law of the store owner, the store manager. And they went to Emmett Till's house. They took him to a barn. They beat him. They gouged one of his eyes out. They shot him in the head. They threw him in the river. They tied a large fan around his neck with barbed wire. And they killed him, and the prosecutor had reservations about bringing an indictment for this killing. He wasn't confident that they would get a conviction in the South, in Mississippi, in 1955 for white men killing a black boy. But indeed, after the indictment was brought, both were found innocent, and it took the jury 67 minutes to deliberate and find that innocent conclusion. And one of the jurors said after the trial, quote, "If we hadn't stopped to drink some pop, it wouldn't have taken that long." And so there was a concept in the idea of critical race theory, which has been mentioned. Critical race theory has been mentioned a couple of times already tonight. But there's a concept called legal narrative. There are narratives running in our minds all the time about things that are happening around us and people's roles in our lives and in society. And in Mississippi in 1955, there was a narrative of white supremacy, which told these two gentlemen that they could kill Emmett Till and get away with it. And apparently, it seemed that they were correct. However, there was a larger narrative. There was a global narrative. The national and international media had already descended upon the scene, and soon thereafter, Emmett Till's murder became an international story. People like Langston Hughes wrote poems about it. James Baldwin wrote a play about it. So it became something that people wouldn't let go. They continued to make noise about it for years and years. And when the Civil Rights Movement happened, a few years later, there was a woman named Rosa Parks who decided that she was not going to get up when they asked her to sit in the back of the bus. And I have a quote here from Mrs. Parks. When asked why she refused to get up and go to the back of the bus, her quote was, "I just thought of Emmett Till, and I just couldn't get up, and I just couldn't go to the back of the bus." And so I want to submit that the story of Emmett Till wasn't over when the case ended. The story continued to evolve, and then there became a broader narrative and a global narrative about justice that endured beyond his killing and endured beyond the trial. And I'm thinking about today, I'm thinking about Mike Brown, I'm thinking about a fresh cut in a very old wound. So I'm thinking about the fact that whatever narratives the officer had running in his head, we don't know what was going on in his mind. We don't know what the grand jury is thinking. We don't know what a jury will think. But we have to think about the idea of narratives, and today, even more than the narrative of white supremacy, I believe the narrative of black criminality is a narrative that we continue to have to stare down. And if you look at the Trayvon Martin case with the hoodie and other sorts of pieces of costume that were mobilized to make the argument that he was a thug and worth killing for that reason. You think about Mike Brown, you think about the release of the video, the narrative of criminality, the New York Times article saying that he was no angel. And you think about the protesters, thousands of protesters who came out on the street demonstrating peacefully, and a handful, 5, 10, 15, who may have thrown water bottles, being sufficient to label all of those protesters rioters or looters. Out of thousands of people, a few dozen can create a narrative of black criminality that is difficult to overcome. So I just want to say that the reality is there's going to be a legal case, a legal narrative. The prosecutor has a great deal of control over the legal narrative and how it plays out in the court system. But beyond that, I believe that just like in the case of Emmett Till, we all have control over the broader narrative and the ultimate narrative that's going to endure for years to come. And I think conversations like this, conversations around mass criminalization, conversations around police brutality, the militarization of the police, racial profiling, these sorts of conversations are how we begin to heal that wound. And so I'm happy to be here today.
Okay, I've never used a pointer before. This is the first. You know, I went to the funeral. One of about 5 white people there. And I was thinking about that, just the funeral itself, the fact that they opened it up to the public. Almost, I was thinking of your phrase, for the sake of all. Right? And it reminded me of Mamie Till, when she opened it up to the public. And this is something she said. She said, 2 months ago, I had a nice apartment in Chicago. I had a good job. I had a son. When something happened to the Negroes in the South, I said, that's their business, not mine. Now I know how wrong I was. The murder of my son has shown me that what happens to any of us, anywhere in the world, had better be the business of us all. Echoes your report beautifully. As a white father of a black son, I've learned so much. You know, I took Adrian on a tour, and Rebecca and Dedrick, they're referring to, and she was saying afterwards, she said, you know, that tour all but predicted Ferguson. What does that mean? You know, this is a quick romp here, but is this where's the point? Oops. This is it. You know, I just want to, you know, just real quickly, you know, we talk about it's just the past. This is nothing current anymore, right? So here's a little bit of our history real quick in St. Louis. You've got the Great Migration. You've got people coming up from south, settling in Mill Creek Valley and the Ville, running into the colored school system with numbers for schools because there couldn't be integrated schools. And where do you go? They settle in these areas because they couldn't live most other places, black folks, because of all of these things, segregation laws, the racial loaning laws. These all made black neighborhoods very different from the immigrant communities we often hear about. It's like, oh, I had an immigrant family. It was hard on them too. It was hard, very hard for black folks than it was there. You've got the Great Divorce then here in St. Louis, between the city and the county. You've got a lot of government programs that were racially blind in their writing. but in their application were locally applied and so had racial outcomes on the ground. You've got, again, all of these things that were beginning to happen in our cities as white folks were leaving. At the same time that's happening, you've got public housing going up for black folks. What you basically have is almost two types of programs. One set that was really designed to help white folks leave the city, and another set that was really designed to keep black folks in public housing in the cities. So what happens is then you get all these African-American neighborhoods that did develop, but over the last few years, they've almost all been torn down. Right? To all of these historic African-American neighborhoods for highways, for shopping malls, over and over. And one of the main ones then was Kinloch. Right? There was a lot of it was torn down for the airport. Interestingly, it had already divided. Berkeley used to be the white part of the North Kinloch. It was the white part of Kinloch, and it's succeeded from Kinloch. It became Berkeley. A lot of people then, with the buyout, started moving to Florissant and Ferguson. Right? What you've got now is all these neighborhoods are gone. You've got the Ville that still exists, but it's really a shell of what it was. A lot of people say we've still got the colored school system, you know, that we really call it by another name, but that's basically what we've got, and now we've got Ferguson. And then and what's happened now is all of these things were much more intractable than just the Jim Crow signs, right? This made it geographically permanent, right? So these become the neighborhoods now where you've got all the predatory lending, the redlining, the food deserts, the brick rustling, the illegal dumping, the schools closing, the educational level falling, the nursing home care falling, property going down, foreclosures up, poverty up, SIDS up, homicides up. These are the social determinants of health that Will Ross talks about. He cites a statistic that's staggering, so get ready for it, that the life expectancy in some of these North St. Louis neighborhoods is about 65.9 years. 65.9 years. In Bangladesh, it's 68. And in some of the urban areas in Bangladesh, it's now up to almost 71. We need to get upset about these pervasive everyday issues, not just the most outrageous ones. And this is the other image. To me, this is the same image as the other one, just in a different hand. This is a child's drawing from my City Faces program. To me, it's all of those things, but just in a child's view. Right? She doesn't know about all that history. She doesn't know about all that structure, all those names and lists, but she knows what her life is like. And she's even split in half, just like you can call it the Mason-Dixon line, you can call it the city-county divorce, you can call it the Delmar divide. But she's split. And look what she says. This is life for us now, right? It's nighttime, the guns are firing at each other, a body, right? She's crying, she's not a natural color here. This is what we want, but don't know how to make it that way. The sun is shining, kids are playing hopscotch and jump rope and not getting shot. Her heart is divided in half, and it says pain is what she feels, not feels. Right? Well, the saddest part for me, the last part I really point out is what she says, well, we don't know how to make it that way, as if this little girl feels that she has to make it that way. Right? It's again, another way of saying it's just personal choices. Right? She's not aware of all the structure that's behind her little drawing. The fact is there are personal choices to be made, but they always occur within a large structural system. And we really and that's why I think if these are structural problems, we need structural solutions. And that's why I think Jason's report becomes so crucial for the sake of all. Last thing I'll ask very quickly, or just tell you, when I ask my students first day, one of the questions I ask my students first day of class is, how many of you have been affected by racism? Very few raise their hands, and usually the minorities raise their hands. And we poke a little bit, and before long, every hand goes up. It's just that some of us have been affected positively by it, and others negatively.
So it's really great to be back at home at WashU, though I wish it were under different circumstances. So I'm a former teacher, and so I need you all to participate in something with me really quickly. Raise your hand and keep it raised if you are from or have ever lived in any of the following places: Ohio, California, New York, St. Louis. Now raise your other hand and keep it raised. Raise both hands. Ezell Ford, John Crawford III, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Dante Parker. All African American men from places where you have all lived, all 5 of them died at the hands of law enforcement in the last month. In the last month. And like everyone with both hands raised right now, none of them were brandishing a weapon. Ezell Ford, John Crawford III, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Dante Parker. You can put your hands down. So when I was a senior here and finishing up my studies in African American studies, shout out to Dr. Z, how you doing? I was writing my senior thesis on Emmett Till. And I decided to title that thesis with another quote from his incredibly brave mother. Because what she said was that she decided not only to open up that funeral to the public, and not only to open up that funeral to the press, but to open up that casket to both of those people, to both of those groups of people. And she said she did that because she wanted the whole world to see what they done to my boy. The whole world was forced to bear witness to that atrocity. And the co-CEO of Teach for America asked me on an organization-wide call, how did you know where to be when this was going down? How did you know to go and spend your evenings in Ferguson? How did you know to go and meet with other young leaders in the area? How did you know what to do and where to be? And I said, I had to force myself to bear witness. I had to force myself to bear witness to what was happening 12 minutes from where I grew up and where I still live in Florissant. And I had to force myself to bear witness to the people who are often the most overlooked and have remained the most overlooked in this situation, are young people. And so I forced myself to bear witness to them, to their needs, to their hurt, to their pain, to their frustration, and also committed myself, along with people like Justin and many others, to amplify those voices so that they would not continue to go unheard. And so in that time, here's what I heard. I heard from an 8-year-old who is cousins with a student that's being taught by one of our core members, and she brought her student and her student's cousins to our office with her while she was making some copies, and I asked him what he knew about the case, and he told me, and then I asked him, I said, Eric, what do you think when you see a police officer? And he told me, run. He's 8. His younger cousin, when they were leaving the office with Miss Donner, their teacher who is white, she was holding the youngest one's hand, and a police officer walked toward them, and he immediately ran behind Miss Donner. And when she said, what are you doing? He said, the police are right over there. I need you to protect me. He's 5. When I talked to some more of my teachers about what was going on in their classrooms and in their schools, one of them, who's an elementary school teacher, told me about a student of hers who she had to send to the office because he was crying hysterically and wouldn't stop crying. And when they finally got him to calm down enough to say what was wrong with him, he said, they're killing little boys like me. He's 7. And so what that tells me is that our children are internalizing messages, whether or not we are intentionally giving them and whether or not we are asking them what's going on with them. Here's what else we know. We know that Gallup took a poll and asked black men how many of them had been unfairly treated by the police in the last 30 days alone, and a quarter of them said yes. We know that when you replicate the doll test today, black kids and white kids will tell you that the black doll is ugly, evil, and can't be trusted, and that the white doll is pure and right. We know, according to recent psychological findings, that our young African American children are viewed as older and more criminal than white children by everyone, including law enforcement. And we know that if you are the victim of a police-involved shooting, you are going to get portrayed worse in the New York Times than the Boston Marathon bomber, right? And so all of these things put together really is about a question of value. And those internalized messages that our kids are getting are saying that people see my blackness as a weapon, even though it's just how I was born, and I'm not ashamed of it. And that I am of no consequence and have no value to this world, right? That my life is less valuable than someone else's. And then when we ask them to tell us what's on their mind and they admit that to us, that they say, I don't feel like people love me, I don't feel like people appreciate me, I don't feel like people believe in me, I think people view me as a threat, we then tell them that they must be lying. Because if it's invisible to mainstream America, it must not be possible, to Professor Wanzo's point earlier, right? So we tell them you're making that up. It must just be the circumstances of this particular case. That can't possibly be necessary. You shouldn't have to call the police department. And by the way, I just talked to a white adoptive parent of 3 black boys who had to walk her children into the police station every time they turned 16, because when the first one turned 16, he was pulled over 3 times in the first month of being 16 in St. Louis County. So we tell them that it's not real, which means that we double up on this internalized message that they're not valued, because first I don't value your life, and then I don't even believe you when you tell me that you feel like your life isn't valued. And so what's been frustrating as an educator and someone who trains educators is that Mike Brown's diploma didn't save him. And so I've been telling children all this time that education is your pathway, your access to liberty, your access out of oppression, and yet that diploma didn't save him like a different skin color would have. He did all the things in school that we told him to do. And his mother reminded us of that. She said, do you know how hard it is to keep a young black man in school? Do you know how many of them graduate? She said, not many, because you consistently bring them down to this level and they don't feel like they have anything to live for. So she got him to graduation. He got himself enrolled in college. And 2 days before he was supposed to get there, was dead and laying in the street for 4 hours. And so as an educator, I'm saying, what am I supposed to do? Because all the things I'm telling you aren't working. But here's the point where I contradict myself, because I actually believe that education can and has to be the place where we fix this, not reactively, right? Not just saying we need citizens review boards, but we do, right? And not just saying we need justice for Mike Brown, but we do. But how do we prevent this preemptively? And so quickly, 3 things. I think the first is that community policing can actually begin in schools. When school resource officers are in schools, you had best believe that some of those messages that 8-year-old, 7-year-old, and 5-year-old that I talked to were internalizing. They're learning that at school when they're getting overly punitive punishments for minor behavior infractions, right? And they're being sent to an officer for talking out, right? And so if we actually are training those school resource officers differently and those police officers in those neighborhoods differently, to say, do not see a criminal, see a human being, see a child, see someone who may make childish mistakes, see someone whose life is of the same value as your child. Imagine how different that would feel. The number of times that I was on the streets in Ferguson this week and I heard, I've never felt closer to black people than I have these last 2 weeks. Because everybody bonded over trauma. There was some trauma bonding. And then people actually had something to rally against together. So there were gang members out there from different sets who actually put down their weapons and put down their beef in order to be against police brutality. Can you imagine if we had that level of unity, not just between African-American children and African-American young people, but between the people patrolling and policing their neighborhoods and African-American young people? The second piece is that we have to continue to affirm the value of our children. I just left a session with our teachers saying, how are you using this experience to influence what's happening in your classroom? And one of my teachers exactly correctly and astutely said, I need them to know that they are loved, because our children don't feel very loved by any of us right now. If a 7-year-old is afraid that he's gonna die in the streets, he needs somebody to give him a hug, literally and figuratively. And that hug needs to last throughout his educational experience. The third piece, though, has to be wrapped up in anti-racist education. Because racism is taught and racism is learned. And so in K-12 education, in higher education, in our homes, in our places of worship, in our social networks, online and offline, in our groups of friends, in our honoraries, in our extracurricular activities, the question has to be this: how do we stop teaching it? How do we unlearn what we've learned? And how do we make sure that we teach others differently? Racism requires tacit support and approval. Don't think that just because you are not actively being racist, that you are not contributing to that system. You have to be actively anti-racist and push in the other direction, right? And that's required of all of us. And so that can happen in our places of education. Thanks very much.
Will I lose my dignity? Will someone care? Will I wake tomorrow from this nightmare? The tenuous yet urgent nature of this question is one which emerges from my body often. In the brief time that is mine today, rather than to steal my larger research, both examining the fragility of the lives of Black queer men, or my work which insists on establishing new reading practices for Black people and their bodies, I have established that today it is a must to bring the body back. Bring the body back is not simply a cute theoretical gesture toward marking the body or pronouncing the body, or even a move to make the pain Black body once again a spectacle for those to gather in both grief and guilt relief. But rather what I wish to do is bring the body back in focus so that we can best cultivate policy, practice, perspective that never forgets that the details of a specific killing does not undo the distribution of the discursive and physical whip, which seemingly makes hieroglyphs across the backs of those who die and suffer under America's slick racism. Over and over, I have heard that the tensions are around race, but I offer that the tension is perpetuated by Black consciousness of American racism and the constant white denial of American racism, a point John Stewart so astutely made last evening. Indeed, there is an importance in discussing Ferguson as a cultural space written with some of the systemic problems that cities and towns all over this country share. So many here today have already distilled this so acutely. However, the erasure, elision, or fading of Mike Brown's body from the conversation and a focus on Ferguson potentially separates and disaggregates Mike Brown from the corpus of bodily texts which share both in a fact unarmed and which echo, don't shoot. To solely become focused on Ferguson allows us to think about the restoration of a city rather than a restorative process, which means restoring a city while renovating our minds of what I call canonical prejudices, which deem Black boys and girls as having a greater propensity towards violence and thus a greater threat to not only society, but even those who carry heavy armor that only Blackness seems to overpower. Dare I say, a focus on the architecture, the numbers, the systems of inequality may produce necessary foci, while at the same time distracting or detracting from the humanist position. Hence, bring the body back to not count the numbers, but enumerate the violences and vestiges of American racism which hide behind protection and services, but make themselves not just apparent in the shooting of our youth, but in the subsequent response to claims of injustice and injury. To speak to what a body did and what a body did not do requires an investigation of bodily motive and the physical use of discipline as punishment, which almost always seems to mark some bodies as always untamed by the nature of their misunderstood history, and imagines the black body larger than it ever could be, capable of more than is often humanly possible. A black body is always filled with excess. Bodies were said to excessively take to the streets, but they took to the streets not simply because one body was defiled, but because the defiling of multiple bodies is a representation of a defilement of blackness across the globe. However, in media on Ferguson, the reporters, writers, and other folks focused largely on the actions of the activist protesters rather than the acts they were protesting. Instead of seeing the admission of poverty and ill treatment in looting acts, black bodies were then subjected to yet another violence, the chimeric lens, the media, which frames these bodies as violent and animalistic, a narrative in conversation with both the recent framing of Mike Brown. This narrative, I argue, justifies the treatment of his body, laid on the ground, bloodied for 4 hours, for an inadvertent reminder that this could be you. A disciplinary motif, indeed. Elizabeth Alexander paints the picture this way. It might be that the white-authored narrative deliberately contradicts the history our bodies know. For what is gained when we bring the bodies back is a recognition of what the words from the musical Rent nicely illuminated at my start, that even I, the middle-class professor who is a card-carrying smiler, is haunted by a collective traumatic history, one which is not rooted in an imagining, but a repeated offense against black bodies, black male bodies, black female bodies, black queer bodies, blackness. Thus, the protest to not discuss Michael Brown in school is more than a we don't want irresponsible conversations, but an inadvertent attempt to mute the body, to sever its posthumous purpose, and to allow us to forget the Mike Browns, Trayvon Martins, Ezell Ford, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride. The list never seems to end. We must bring the body back into our focus to remind us of the crimes against blackness that are possible, alleviating the anomalous suggestions and allowing folks to see how insidious American racism is. Yes, we must revive Ferguson and reconcile the historic violence done to his people. We must never forget the way in which this traumatic act instigated a collective historical trauma which has never meant redemption or return to a valued body, a black body unharmed, but rather a way to keep us quiet, docile, in check. We must bring the body back, and our bodies must have their backs before they're gone.
The truth is I've had a very difficult time coming up with a coherent intellectual response to the past few weeks. I was on a family vacation when Michael Brown was fatally shot, and my initial response had very little to do with the frameworks, theories, or data from my discipline of public health. My reaction was at a more visceral level. A young man was shot and killed, and his body was lying in the middle of the street for several hours. And I was born 5 miles from where it happened. I'm also the father of a little boy who, God willing, will someday be an 18-year-old. My wife and I are working very hard to provide resources for him that will allow for his boundless success. But my fear is that his already evident brilliance, his energy, his loving heart will not be noticed in some split-second encounter that could do him grave harm. I also hurt for my hometown to see it racked with unprecedented convulsions of violence in response to the shooting death of Michael Brown. My parents took me home from the hospital to a small municipality called Northwoods, almost directly south of Ferguson. The events of the last several weeks are not academic abstractions to me. They are about my life, my family, and my home. That is why I love the title of this discussion, and I thank Rebecca and Jeffrey for it. This is a discussion about Michael Brown, an actual human being, characterized by all the complexity and profundity that humanity entails. I'm missing a page. And it's the proposition of Michael Brown's humanity that is my point of departure in these remarks. His humanity is actually a somewhat subversive or controversial proposition, it turns out. I called one of my friends who is a brilliant social psychologist to ask about what social psychology could teach us about these events. And it turns out quite a bit. There's research to suggest a notion called the suspicion heuristic. Heuristics are mental shortcuts that we take for processing the world around us. And it turns out that criminal is the shorthand that gets used for race in the United States. And we have research to support that. In fact, a black teenager is more readily assumed to be a criminal than a peer from another group. And this work builds on a large body of research in what we call implicit bias in psychology. This is concerned with these automatic associations that we make, again, at the level of largely non-conscious processing. For instance, when research participants quickly associate the word criminal with a picture of an African American. And this is not happening at the level of voluntary control. Rather, these associations are furnished by culture and society, by ready-made stereotypes that lead individuals to have them. One set of studies also conducted by the researchers who identified suspicion heuristic suggests that even as young as age 10, black children are perceived to be both older and less innocent than other children. And the principal explanation for this perception, according to the research, is that black children, particularly black boys, are implicitly perceived as less human than other children. An additional set of studies has examined the areas of the brain that are activated when we experience empathy for others. The upshot of this research is that the areas of the brain that we would expect to light up when empathy for others is experienced do not light up when witnessing pain in an individual of a different race. But social psychology also offers some hope in all of this. In Gordon Allport's classic contact theory on the positive effects of intergroup contact, we find some answers to what can be done to increase the likelihood that other individuals are perceived as equally human. 5 conditions must be present for this to happen. We have to have opportunities to cooperate with members of other groups. We have to have the support of major institutions and people in positions of authority that encourage our contact with each other. We have to have equal status and access to resources. We have to have some common goal that we are all working towards. And we have to have the ability to meet one another as acquaintances. All of this goes back to many of the findings we highlighted in For the Sake of All, but chief among them, how separated we are from one another, both physically and psychologically, along lines of race in St. Louis and in America. No remedy for our current crisis can be successful if we do not confront that, and confront the conditions of contact theory that remain largely unmet in our region. We can only change these unconscious processes with very conscious work toward equality and interaction.
So I know you all have cards, and you were hopefully prompted to ask some questions. If you have questions, if you could please come forward, because I'm sure we want to take advantage of this truly extraordinary panel. But while we wait, I think I'll start off asking, again, sort of a question of Kathy and Justin about evidence. One of the things I think that I sort of try to figure out or struggle with in relationship to these events, and I just, in the last several months, two other places I've called home have had these events and protests. Durham, North Carolina, where someone was, there were protests after someone allegedly shot himself when he was handcuffed with his hands behind his back in a police car. And then Dayton, Ohio, a suburb, which some of you might have heard of that, now it's come out that he was leaning on a BB gun, this man in a Walmart, and someone said he seemed to be, walking around threateningly with the BB gun, and Ohio is an open carry state, by the way, and then he was apparently shot in the back, both African-American men. And so I struggle with what seemed to have happened with the Amadou Diallo case, the ways in which the only justification that's needed is fear that's reasonable of African-American men. But if African-American men are constructed as criminals, then it seems that it is always reasonable to shoot them. So I'm trying to figure out or negotiate that. So could you unpack that for me? Maybe.
Well, if you're asking, you put it first as a matter of evidence. Mm-hmm. And so I take that as, you're thinking about the legal kinds of concepts and it's really two things that I want to say about that. And one of them kind of goes to something that Brittany actually was talking about, which was the little boy who said, when I see police, I flee, I run, right? And I want to, because it goes to how the law views some things that a lot of people have mentioned tonight and that are pretty important, okay? There was a Supreme Court opinion that dealt with a number of African-American young men who saw police and ran away, okay? And the issues for this don't matter too much, but what does matter is what the court, well, Justice Scalia, writing for a number of people on that court, said this. They were trying to decide, is there reasonable suspicion for a police officer when he sees a bunch of guys running away to think they've done something bad, okay? And Justice Scalia said that it would be unreasonable to stop for brief inquiry young men who scatter in panic upon the mere sighting of the police is not self-evident and arguably contradicts proverbial common sense. See Proverbs 28:1. The wicked flee when no man pursueth, okay? So you've got a real disconnect between the law and lived experience, right? In terms of, what is evidence, okay? The same is the law and implicit bias, right? Unconscious racism. The law does not recognize those as legal concepts, all right? In the constitutional sense, the Supreme Court has made very clear the only kind of thing we're interested in is the real, deliberate, intentional. Well, they've just then written everything out of reality, right? I mean, it's so I don't know if that responds at all to what you're saying, but as a legal question, the courts have really taken care of dismissing everything that you're asking about.
And just to chime in also on the legal issue, you raised a number of excellent points. The case is called Washington v. Davis. It's a case which talks about how when looking for discrimination, there has to be evidence of discriminatory intent, especially when you're talking about statutes that would be seen to be unconstitutional on the grounds of being racially biased. So they have a very difficult standard to meet. I don't know how many racists sit down and create evidence and write down their plan to engage in a racially motivated act. The Zimmerman case is an example of that, where there was a federal investigation, but we haven't seen a federal case brought against him because they weren't able to find that evidence of racial intent. But at the same time, there are limits on what police can do in terms of using force against suspects. There's a case, Tennessee versus Garner, which actually is an authority which was heard in 1985, which is an authority which says, the Supreme Court said that you can only use deadly force against a fleeing felon when the felony at issue is a dangerous or violent felony, for the most part. So here in this case, there was a person who was fleeing and they used deadly force, and there was a statute here that said that they could use deadly force against this fleeing person even when what they were being pursued for was nothing violent, nothing that suggested that this was a dangerous person who was going to hurt anybody.
Missouri law says
so Missouri law is a similar statute. And so that's why Kathy, she rightly pointed out that there's a real question about the constitutionality of the current statute governing the use of force by police. So the Supreme Court, in the past, in the 80s at least, had this case, and there is some limit on what they can do. The question is, what is going to happen here in Missouri as we see this statute enforced on the national and international stage?
I just want to piggyback on this thought about reasonableness and rationality. Right. The suspicion heuristic is actually introduced in a law journal. It's a lawyer, a professor of law, and a professor of psychology working on this together. You do not need to be an avowed racist to have these associations.
That's right.
You simply need to have an unconscious bias. And it happens at a level of mental processing, and this is uncomfortable for us.
Yes.
A lot of our mental processing happens at an unconscious level.
Right.
So people who wouldn't necessarily outwardly espouse racist views, nevertheless have these associations, and the law,
right,
one would think, should take that into account.
Right, and it's quite the opposite. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions from the audience. So one, it's directed towards Brittany and Jason, but could possibly go to others. So how do you respond to the skepticism that Mike Brown's death is a race issue? Because I'm sure you've seen that the polls, particularly the Pew poll, that said that there was a racial split in terms of the number of people who saw it as a race issue. Is it a positive or negative move to view Michael's death as a symbol of distrust and fear and racism? And then the second part is is rioting justified, actually? Is rioting justified in response to an event like Mike Brown's killing? What other option does the community have when peaceful protests rarely make the news?
Sure. I want to take the second part first, just because I want to make sure that we are very, very clear about what has happened in Ferguson over the last 2 weeks, okay? There was very, very limited rioting. The one major night of it was Sunday evening, that first Sunday evening, and I hesitate to even use the word major. It's interesting, I decided that I wanted to put some money into Ferguson on that Monday because it was close to my house. And so I went and ate breakfast over there, and my car broke down, and I was told that my car could not get towed from over at West Florissant on that day. I decided never to use that tow company again. But as an aside, but that goes to show us, right, that whatever impression is left when those moments happen, because for the remainder of those weeks, there was not looting. There was not rioting. And when I got tear gassed, I was standing on a sidewalk talking to a middle schooler. That narrative continued to be dominant, and that when the tear gassing got worse and people had to break into McDonald's to get milk to save their eyes, the press said they're looting again, right? And so I just want to make sure that we're clear about the truth versus the narrative. But Dr. King, of all people, is the one who reminds us that a riot is the language of the unheard.
That's right.
So I don't actually think the question is about whether or not it's justifiable, because if we're going to ask that question, then we need to very clearly ask whether or not Mike Brown's shooting death was justifiable, right? Let's put the focus on where it should be. And whether or not it is justifiable is not the point, right? The question is, what are we doing to prevent the things that are making people feel like their only outlet is to loot? As far as skepticism, I think that this panel has done an incredible job of giving all of us in this room a very step-by-step understanding of just how connected this is to race. And at the end of the day, I don't believe that there is any other group of people, except for men of color in particular, who walk around with this fear every day. And we have to be willing to talk about where that fear comes from and that it is legitimate. And so I think this point that you've made about shared experience and intergroup experience will help lead us to the place where we get around that skepticism, because again, it can't be about what's invisible to the mainstream and therefore it doesn't exist. We have to ensure that the invisible becomes visible, so that that's no longer a question.
Just briefly, I would say that the research that I found in trying to understand and unpack what this incident meant around at the level of brain circuitry, the fact that you can see, and in this study you're seeing pain inflicted on someone else's hand. You can't see their face, can't see their emotional expression. Just the color of their hand means that the parts of your brain that are wired for empathy don't light up. So when I see Mike Brown lying in the street, I can assure you my brain's lighting up like crazy, because of a level of empathy at a very basic kind of visceral level that for some people may not be there. And it may not be there because of mental processes that people aren't even aware of. At their deepest core, where Mike Brown is not a human being, something less than a human being. To me, that's at the center of this.
Okay. So I have another question. What are strategies for effectively challenging racist or insensitive comments about Ferguson?
Well, I'll give it a shot. I think that there is an understanding that needs to be had in initial conversations about this. For example, I've had to face some insensitive remarks over the past week or so, and my strategy has been to sit down and reasonably discuss the facts of the case. And I found that even the insensitive remarks that I've come across, for the most part, people, if they're willing to really engage the truth and separate the truth from the inflammatory rhetoric and some of the things in the media, I found people, once they realized that, for example, they weren't all rioters. So you're talking about, I keep repeating this, you talk about 4,000 or 5,000, 6,000 people out protesting, and maybe 20 or 15 of them are looters. I mean, look around the room, out of 200 people, if one of you loots, to call all of you looters and rioters is irrational. So there's a lot of irrational discussion happening around this issue. And when you try to sit down and have rational discussions with people, I've found that for the most part, in my case, even the people who make insensitive remarks can be reasoned with. And I think there is and I really want to support Dr. Purnell. There's actually a website you can go to take the implicit association test, so you can see for yourself just how real this unconscious bias is for all people. People from all ethnic backgrounds have the same challenge. And the website is implicit.harvard.edu/implicit. Can you guys remember that? It's pretty straightforward. Implicit.harvard.edu/implicit. You can take the test yourself, and you don't have to tell anybody your results. But the statistics show that the majority of Americans, even black people, even people of color, have these implicit associations that frame their ability to empathize with people based on skin color. And in general, questions of fear, questions of irrational responses to people, all these questions are really ripe questions. And if you sit down and talk with people rationally, I found people to be generally willing to dialogue.
Hi, my name is Anjanette Smith, and I do have a question of something I've heard. It's kind of related to some of the points that you made, Mr. Purcell, about having opportunities just to become acquaintances. And this is my question. I have heard about possible policies for police officers to live in the areas that they patrol. Is there any success with that? And does it improve relations with the residents? So, thank you.
So I will preface this by saying I am not a criminal justice expert, but there are several successful models of community policing from around the country that involve a number of efforts at involving citizens and police officers in constructive engagement with one another. we know that when you have the opportunity to see someone not as a stereotype, not as a prototype, but as an individual human being, you're much more likely to give them the benefit of the doubt. So I think that's the theory behind that.
And I would add to that and say that this is one of the things that I'm really invested in, right? Is how do we begin to establish better ways of understanding and reading, right, black men, particularly in this case. And over again, I do think it's a question of proximity, right? How close or how far do we feel from those with whom we are suspicious, right? And it is very difficult. I mean, this has happened to me several times. I tell the story over and over in every class that I teach. You know, there are days when I'm in my jogging pants, my fitted hat, and a tank top going to the garbage can. And my neighbors do not recognize me as the same person who came out the front door suited up. And there's a different relationship that they create with me when I go through the alleyway, right? And it's like I'm a different person. And I think that, you know, what I do, one of the strategies that I use to kind of backtrack to even the last question, is I actually say, hey, how are you? How you doing? Right? And then there is a kind of relationship, right? A recognition of, oh, that was you. Oh, ew, I need to check that. Right? And if you're brave enough, you actually will unveil that moment for the neighbor. And I think that some of us have to be so brave, both allies and individuals who are, you know, of color, right, have to be so brave sometimes to do that. And I'm not putting the onus, you know I'm not doing that, I'm not putting the onus on me. But what I am saying is that there is a collaboration that can happen within community. And I think that same collaboration can happen even with police, right?
And can I just quickly piggyback off that, which actually is an answer to the question that you asked right before this about active anti-racism, and I was thoughtful because I wanted to actually give some legitimate resources here. And I also just want to say ahead of time, I apologize. In a few minutes, I'm going to have to scoot out to actually go have a similar conversation at Channel 9 with some other folks. But I genuinely appreciate being here and the opportunity to have this dialogue. So a couple of things. Go read Tim Wise. He's not perfect by far, but he is, I think, one of the leading voices we have in white allyship. Also, this is a pretty classic book at this point, but Dr. Beverly Tatum, the president of Spelman College, why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria? And she actually talks about the moving walkway of racism, right? And so this is what I meant earlier by that tacit support and approval. You can be standing still on the walkway and still moving forward on the walkway, right? And so she talks about how you can be actively countercultural, right, and be the counterforce that is moving in the other direction to eventually change the direction of the walkway. So that's a really great resource. There's also a book called Critical Conversations on Race that actually gives some very practical tools about how to have the dialogue that Justin talked about. You should also look at a website called the Microaggressions Project that I will say is put together by some friends of mine, but they're very brilliant people. Because a lot of this is about unearthing things when they are happening and calling them out for people and calling them out for yourself when you are participating in them. And so that is a very helpful place. And then I can't remember the exact source, but if you Google it about dominant culture, you can actually start to look at some of the practices of dominant culture in the workplace, in education, in your classrooms, so that you can be thinking about how to counteract some of those, right? So if everything is done on a spreadsheet, that is actually dominant culture, right? Because it is dominant culture to say this is how we lay things out instead of mind mapping things or doing something else. And so how to create more inclusive culture in your student groups or wherever you are leading in those spaces is another helpful way.
So I did promise I would get because they're so in demand. I would get Justin and Brittany out here earlier. So the final question I'd like to ask is a question that received from the audience about what they can do. But I have these questions, and I think we might be able to think of some creative way through WashU Voices to get them up there and asked and maybe answered. So people ask, so what can students, or I think we should also put it out, faculty, staff, just members of the WashU community, what kinds of things can they do this semester or this year to help? And this is a slide from our Gephardt Institute, some resources we have and some things we've been doing. And again, I need to continue to say this is not the last conversation we will have this semester or this year or in the future about these issues or to continue outreach. So what kinds of things can people do?
A thought that's been occurring to me over the last few days and weeks is that don't just do something, stand there. We need intensive listening at this point. The urge and impulse to go in like Mighty Mouse and save the day will not work in this situation. There are young people, as Brittany said, who've never felt heard a day in their lives. And they were out there. And they need to be listened to. So what we do is listen and then act based on what they tell us. At least that's what I feel very deeply.
Can I add, this is, I mean, obviously, for understandable reasons, we're thinking about Ferguson, but it is also true. I mean, I have for the last 7 years been taking law students to a school in the city, public high school, and they go there once a week. And they talk, and they listen, and they teach, and they learn. And I guess what I'm saying is that Ferguson has, a tremendous number of problems that are shared. Now, it's not just like, well, that happened in Ferguson, right? And so there are lots of places you could go in the city, and I would urge people to think about ways to simply go out and become a member of the wider community of St. Louis in whatever way is, comfortable for you to really get involved, not like this week, this month, or this year, but just while you're here, be a member of the community. The law students have absolutely so benefited and felt, they're there for the kids, but they also say, oh no, it did much more for me than I did for them.
I really want to piggyback on that one. Those of you who know me know exactly why I said it, right? Because I think what I'm very suspicious of these programs that start out to be programs. I mean, it's really just, what we really need is relationships. And that's what we're talking about, right? But how do you get them? Again, that's kind of an easy thing to say, right? So, but that requires some border crossing, right, in this city. So then you have to talk about how you do that sensitively, how you do it over time, not just an event. I think you have to ask, again, how is the community going to benefit from this? Not how am I going to feel good about myself? I think, and I notice when we go on our tours, I deliberately try to introduce the students to people. So it doesn't become this tour of issues, of places, of buildings, but it's a tour of Miss Lovey and Reverend Davis and Carla and Miguel, right? And that changes everything. I think something else we could think about is, we always try to think about these big events, but I've been telling my students, if you want to do something, and some of you suggested, go patronize the businesses. Go to Red's Burger Place and get something, right? So instead of thinking about these sort of big events, think about where you spend your money every day for 70 years. Right?
Yeah.
So instead of going online to save a couple bucks, you know, go to one of these places to get to know people and support the communities. Because we all lament when they disappear, but where were we when they needed support?
That was also something that I was going to say, you know, spend our money in places that we say we are concerned about. But I also think that we have to not allow ourselves to forget this moment. Right? It's very easy to get caught up in the 2 weeks, the 2 months, and even maybe the 2 years, right? But after WashU, after your collegiate experience, after your marriage, after your divorce, after your whatever, right? This is an ongoing, right, conversation. And you all, many of you all in this room will have opportunities to be in decision-making positions. And I hope that it will be so inscribed in you. And that's one of the reasons I teach, right? Is because I want to inscribe a consciousness that you can take into your life beyond this space. And so I think we don't call this out enough. Activism is also about never forgetting. That's the reason why people are activists, because they won't allow us to forget, right? And so I really want to stress that.
I'd like to just add one more thing too then. You know, being active, of course, I couldn't agree more. But you know, sometimes we go in and act without really listening, right? Yeah. And you know, instead of saying, here's what I'd like to do for you, with you, whatever, say, well, here I am, how would you like to use me?
Yes.
Right?
It's an excellent point. So super quickly, it's courageous conversations on race, not critical conversations. I apologize. And I just want to emphasize everything that was just said is excellent advice. The thing to layer on top of that always is what I heard one of my mentors say to a room full of teachers about a month ago. He asked people if they were really out there trying to win for students, for kids, for their community, or if they were just trying to look good trying. So if you are doing any of this stuff, creating proximity, building relationships, making sure people don't forget, making sure you don't forget, and you're doing it to look good, stop. That is not helping anybody. And it's most of all not helping you.
So, we have to wrap up this panel, and I think it's an extraordinary panel, and I feel really blessed to have sat here and listened to it. And I want to say that, you know, Professor Goldwasser, or Kathy, ended her comments by referencing comments hurled against one of her colleagues for naming her injury and her pain. And I think that one of the things that's always been interesting to me or important in my research, and like Jason and I, you know, when this happened, it's hard to sort of approach this intellectually, but there's something that fails my analytic abilities when I see human beings referred to as things or animals, which is so often what happens when we have these kinds of discourses about racial injury, and the ways in which particularly African American men are seen as not human, but and lots of people, the other is often dehumanized. And I think that part of what has always drawn me to the university is one place, even though it fails me often, is the idea that we can elevate discourse and really think about seeing the human. And one of the poems that sort of stuck in my head, and I'll just end with language again here, is because so much of the language has been about the un-Americanness of the protest, or that Brown is outside of citizenship, because part of what happens when these events occur is that people are constructed as not just not good citizens, but not citizens at all. And I keep thinking, or I've had in my head Langston Hughes' poem, I Too Sing America. I'm the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. Thank you.